Hello, this is Will Stutzman, and I'm going to be talking to you today about blogging within the social studies. The purpose of this study is to analyze the implementation of using blogging as an instructional tool in a 10th grade social studies classroom. Throughout this study, I will collect data to evaluate the effectiveness of blogging as a means of incorporating the process in my own 10th grade world history classroom. So before I dive into my research, I'm going to define what a blog is. So a blog, or known as a weblog, is basically just a discussion or informational site that's published on the internet consisting of entries displayed in reverse chronological order. Through blogging, students are able to foster their creativity and their personal experiences. As a means of instruction, they can reflect on their learning, participate in online discussions, and receive constructive feedback from their instructor and also their peers. So the reason I began to investigate blogging, or technology rather, is that there has been a recent push for incorporating web-based technologies into curriculum. So it is fitting that blogging works within my curriculum because the world history curriculum aims to foster this idea of creating global citizens. So at the end of the world history curriculum, students can be exposed to all the different criteria that creates a global citizen. And also, 21st century literacy skills are needed to discuss major world issues, which ultimately, discussing these world issues, are pertinent to becoming a global citizen. So, I am going to basically investigate how blogging affects this and how it really can foster this idea that the world history curriculum is trying to reach at. So one of the main arguments when incorporating technology in the classroom is that technology allows the environment of the classroom to be student-driven opposed to teacher-driven. So when I just started to incorporate various technologies in my own classroom, I started to see an increase in the engagement levels of my students, and I also began to see an increase in the amount of assignments completed. So, because of these observations, I began to explore the various ways I could incorporate technology further into my classroom to foster this sort of learning environment. Because the best way that students learn is simply by doing them. So, today I'm going to explore what I did to try and foster this learning environment. Furthermore, to align technology with the goals of world history and, in particular, my professional learning team, our goal this year is to improve our students' critical thinking skills through the methods of writing. So because of this, I began to explore blogging. According to Zelinsky, 2009, these essential new literacies of online reading comprehension emphasize higher order thinking skills and can be practiced through blogging. So when I read this quote, I thought of the ideas that I could start to implement in my classroom to promote these things. So naturally, blogging became the front runner. Moving into my literature review on classroom blogging, I found a few quotes that really resonated with me. So, the first one I'm going to mention is according to Hefner, many teachers struggle with motivating students to learn. This is especially prevalent in social studies classrooms in which students perceive social studies as boring. So, I noticed this problem to be pretty persistent in my own social studies classroom. I noticed that the engagement was pretty low when technology was not incorporated. Hefner further states that using technology to complete assignments changes the learning environment to focus on mastery learning while also promoting cooperative learning. Class is less structured and diminishes traditional views of competition as a means to motivate. So again, we're going back to this idea of it being from a teacher-centered classroom, which is pretty traditional, to more of a student-centered learning classroom, which increases this student engagement and also increases student productivity. So moving on, when blogging is further introduced into the curriculum, the authenticity of assignments can be increased. According to Fry, Treven, and Copenhaver, by publishing student work, teachers increase the authenticity of student learning and also increase the possibility of wider audience response beyond the classroom community. So teachers are always trying to create an assignment that is authentic to a student's learning, and by blogging, it accomplishes that. So because of this wide-ranging audience, the blogger has an increased sense of ownership of their work, which I think goes hand in hand with this idea of authenticity. The more people that are viewing their work, the more authentic it becomes to them. According to Lin, Li, Hung, and Huang, blogging, is believed to act as an incentive for them to write more successfully in terms of both linguistic skills and attitudes towards writing. Again, it's going back to this idea that more people are viewing what they're producing, thus, it will motivate them to create a better product in the end. Again, this creates more authentic assignments for our students. Now, blogging can also be used as methods to create and promote critical thinking. Weblogs are set up in a way that promotes critical thinking skills and self-reflection, which ultimately results in higher order thinking skills. Hungerford, Kresser, Wiggins, and Amaro Jimenez state to this end, researchers have suggested that when blogs are used as a part of one's coursework, students can be given opportunities to connect what is being learned in the classroom with what is being discussed in blogs. Again, we're trying to promote this environment where students are critically thinking about the material and then producing it and synthesizing it in a way that is meaningful towards them. So because blogging allows for students to move beyond repetition, they are able to reach higher level thinking skills such as synthesis and evaluation. Again, the main goal of our PLT this year is to increase our students' critical thinking skills. So once we reach those elements of elevation and synthesis, we are effectively achieving our goal. So blogging is a great way to do that. So now that I have provided you with some background knowledge of my research on blogging, I'm going to go into my methodology. So this study that I conducted was conducted in a sophomore world history class at David H. Hickman High School in Columbia, Missouri. I decided to choose one focused class of 20 students to study the effects of blogging within my classroom. Typically in my class, I provide background knowledge on historical content. We then scaffold the knowledge that we're going to apply with whatever activity that we do. And then I let the students practice on their own. Usually what we work up to is an AEC writing, which simply stands for an argument, evidence, and commentary. So typically we work on small increments of their writing and then build up to a larger writing. So just practicing their critical thinking skills through writing. So coming back to why I chose blogging, blogging incorporates these skills. So I thought that this would be a nice pair up to compare the effects of writing as a means of blogging versus writing as a means of writing to this. For the purposes of this research, I decided to collect my data in the form of surveys, student work, which would be blogging and AEC writing, and then I also conducted student interviews. So within my focus class, I selected different forms of writing through blogging and AEC writing, and what I basically end up doing is comparing their writing to see what are the effects of blogging within my classroom. I also decided to conduct surveys to see what my students' perceptions of blogging were before the process and also after the process through my student interviews. So the interviews and surveys were merely meant to collect data based on how motivated my students felt and how they felt about blogging. The student work was essentially to compare the critical thinking skills that are represented. So what I began first before I decided to do anything is I decided to give an introduction to blogging to my students in general, what it was, how to use it, and what were the purposes were of blogging. After I provided this brief introduction and some practice, I decided to implement blogging in our second unit of theocratic societies. So, for this unit, students picked a focus question to guide themselves through their research. So this unit was primarily used as a research project about the theocratic society they were assigned to study. Students were to create 2 blog posts throughout this entire 3 or 4 week unit, reflecting on the process of their research and also as a means of recording their research during the duration of the 2-week project. So the course of the unit was 4 weeks, but the project was 2 weeks. The final product was then a poster and a presentation. Then I decided to incorporate the Shifts in Power unit, another blogging reflection. So students in this unit were asked to review for the summative assessment through blogging. What they did was they looked at some guiding questions to guide their thinking, and then also students for this project had to read and comment on another student's blog post. So the 2 assignments were different in the nature, but they were always incorporating blogging throughout the process, just as a different means. So again, the second unit was a means of guiding them through their research, and then the third unit was essentially used to review for the summative assessment. So blogging as a means of review. And I just decided to test it out here because I wasn't really sure of how to incorporate blogging that would best fit my students. So in my findings, I'll go over what I found based on uh, these implementations. And then the last unit, Unit 4, of which I used blogging. Blogs were not required, but were highly encouraged. Each week, questions were posed that stemmed from the classroom content and discussion, and then students had the opportunity to discuss these questions in blog posts and also encouraged to discuss them with their classmates through comments. So during this study, I collected the student work, blogs, and AEC writings, student surveys, and student interviews, just recapping my process. For the interviews, I chose 3 students at the end of all blogging sessions at the end of the semester. So these students reflected multiple ideas or multiple spectrums of their perceptions on blogging throughout their survey process. So I just kind of compared their original answers and then selected these students based on that original survey. So for the purpose of my data analysis, I decided to break it up into 3 different categories. 1, critical or deeper thinking. 2, higher engagement. And 3, AEC paragraphs for comparison of the data. So going into my first category, critical thinking, my data reveals that my students were writing at higher levels in their blog posts, and they exhibited the skills that synthesis and evaluation kind of allude to. So according to Bloom's taxonomy, synthesis and evaluation are typically regarded as higher orders of thinking, so reaching those critical thinking skills. In one of my students' blog posts, as you can see down here, they do exhibit some elements of synthesis and also evaluation. They're taking the prompt and they're evaluating what they think about this content, especially when they say that, in my opinion, power shifts are necessary for societal advancement. The fact that he incorporated this element of, saying, okay, it is necessary, it's showing that he is synthesizing and also evaluating the content in general. Moving on to my next category of increased engagement, I noticed that when I incorporated blogging within my classroom, generally my students were more engaged with the material. And I think this was because it was a shift again back into that student-centered behavior. I collected a quote from one of my student interviews, and this student said that blogging motivated me to learn the material. Because of this, I feel that the assignment kept me more engaged throughout the unit with the assignment. It also motivated me to write well. Since my classmates were going to read my posts, I wanted to make sure to write something worth reading. So this was collected towards the end of the semester, and according to MS, this student feels that because his peers were reading his work, he felt more engaged with the material and felt that this student really needed to produce something worth reading. And finally, my last data analysis is really just a comparison between written works on a traditional piece of paper answering a prompt and also a more open-ended blogging post. So, when reviewing my data, I wanted to compare these 2 elements of writing to see, what were the differences that, blogging offers that maybe the AEC standard does not promote. So to do this, I compared them. I found that on average, my students' blog posts display deeper critical thinking and longer responses. So, going back from my first example for critical thinking, this is the same student's examples, but just in the AEC paragraph. So I pulled this from his commentary section, which is generally supposed to represent analysis. So you could tell from this statement that it isn't as well developed as his blog post. Both of these posts or these writings were an attempt to answer the same kind of question in the same unit. So, from this data, I was really confused as to why this is happening, so I began to notice these differences. And I think what really is the driving motivator is this idea of student-driven classroom that also incorporates the elements of classmates reading your writing, peer feedback. In conclusion, after incorporating blogs into my social studies classroom, I learned that students are motivated from peer feedback, possibly more so than teacher feedback. I thought this element was really interesting going through all my data and noticing my student surveys, which all exclaimed that they felt more motivated through blogging more traditionally than the AEC standard, even though the AEC paragraph or writings were worth more points. So I thought this to be very interesting. I noticed that the writings of my students reflected their perceptions about blogging. So when they were writing that they were more motivated, I really saw this in their blog posts. More students were writing at longer lengths than they were writing on their AEC paragraphs for their summative assessments. And also, blog posts attempted higher order thinking more often than AEC writings did. I feel like this is true because the AEC writings were more close-ended. So I think the nature of the openness of the blog post and the student reflections, they reach the higher order thinking skills that, is desired within the classroom. I think blogging really does do this. So after going through my first trial run of incorporating blogging within my classroom, I would definitely say I would change the method of implementation into my curriculum. So first off, I would definitely want to bring blogging consistently in my curriculum. So in this research study, I really only implemented blogging a few times. And I think if I had my students practice these skills more often, it would promote these higher order thinking skills and increase their engagement even further, which would be awesome. I would also try to incorporate more open-ended posts. My posts or my blog post questions were pretty open-ended, but they could be even more open-ended. I would also implement more optional blog posts to further classroom discussions as a means of enrichment. So I incorporated blogging with the focus of um, getting points. And I think if it was optional, it would appeal to a lot of different students. I also would be interested in seeing how these blogging strategies would enhance the learning of my students. So just noticing the critical thinking skills that I did notice in blogging, I was really impressed with some of my students' thinking. So if I were to incorporate this more often throughout the classroom, I would be really interested to see how this would affect the instruction and also their learning throughout the course of the world history curriculum.